On a quiet street in Waterbury, Connecticut, stood a house that looked just like any other. It was a place where neighbors waved, where life seemed to follow a predictable, suburban rhythm, but behind its closed doors, a secret of unimaginable cruelty was being kept. For over 2 decades, a young man was allegedly held prisoner, not by a stranger, but by his own stepmother. This is a story about the systematic breaking of a human being, the failures of the systems meant to protect him, and the desperate act that finally brought the darkness into the light. It's a case that forces us all to ask a terrifying question. How well do we really know the people living right next door? In the cold of February 2025, a house fire on Blake Street revealed a secret that had been buried for over 2 decades. Firefighters responding to the blaze made a shocking discovery. A 32-year-old man, emaciated and weighing just 68 pounds, told them he had been held captive in a locked room by his stepmother since he was a child. This is the story of how one man's desperate act for freedom unveiled a real-life house of horrors. Waterbury, Connecticut, is a city with a rich industrial past, known as the Brass City. Its neighborhoods are a patchwork of American life, working-class families, quiet streets, and community ties that stretch back for generations. Blake Street was one of those places, a row of modest homes where nothing much out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen. Neighbors knew the Sullivan family, or at least, they thought they did. They saw Kimberly Sullivan and her husband. They saw her daughters. To anyone looking in, they seemed like a normal family, but there was a member of the family they didn't see. A boy, Kimberly's stepson, who just seemed to vanish from public life. He was enrolled in school, but his presence was fleeting. Records show he was pulled from elementary school in the 4th grade, right around the age of 11. This was the point where his world, which should have been expanding with the promise of childhood, began to shrink until it was confined to the 4 walls of a single room. The boy's biological mother, Tracy Valorand, had given up custody years earlier. She and the boy's uncle would later talk about their struggles, the feeling of being pushed away by Kimberly Sullivan, and the slow, painful severing of family ties that left the boy isolated and vulnerable. Neighbors, too, would later recall faint, fragmented memories. One man who lived next door for 10 years said he was never sure if he'd even seen the stepson. He remembered a family member mentioning a fleeting glimpse years ago, a child in a window, wearing a baseball cap. But these were just whispers, ghost-like apparitions in a story whose terrifying reality remained hidden. The house on Blake Street kept its secrets well, showing a face of normalcy to the outside world while a nightmare unfolded within. A home doesn't become a prison overnight. It was a slow, creeping progression of control and cruelty. The abuse, according to the victim's later testimony to police, started long before he was locked away for good. He remembered being as young as 3, sneaking out of a room to get food because he was hungry. When the food wrappers were found, the consequences were severe, setting a pattern of punishment and fear that would define his life. The real turning point came when he was 11 and in the 4th grade. According to the arrest warrant, he was taken out of school for good after 2 visits from the Department of Children and Families, or DCF. The school had reportedly raised alarms about his behavior, including searching for food in the garbage because he was so hungry. But instead of this intervention leading to his rescue, it triggered his complete isolation. Kimberly Sullivan allegedly used the DCF visits as the reason to remove him from the one place where outsiders might notice his suffering. From that day on, his world shrank to a small room on the 2nd floor of the Blake Street house. His prison was locked from the outside. At first, it was a simple lock on the door, but as he grew from a boy into a teenager, and then a young man, the security got tighter. The victim told investigators that the single lock became a chain lock, then a padlock, and finally, a heavy-duty slide bolt. Each new lock was another layer of his entombment, a physical sign of his stepmother's tightening grip. He was trapped, and with every year that passed, the idea of escape seemed to fade further away. Life in that room was a desolate existence. He was let out for as little as 15 minutes a day, just long enough for chores or a brief, controlled moment outside his cell. His father, who also lived in the home, passed away in January 2024. After his death, the abuse reportedly got even worse. The victim stated he was then locked in the room for 22 to 24 hours a day. Starvation was a constant tool of control. His meals were tiny, his body wasted away, and his health collapsed. He told investigators he hadn't seen a doctor or a dentist in the 2 decades he was held captive. He couldn't even remember the last time he'd had a bath. Fear was the invisible lock that kept him from fighting back. He explained to investigators that he never cried out or tried to break free because of a constant threat of longer lockdowns and further diminishment of food if he dared to disobey. This psychological torture was as powerful as any physical barrier. He was conditioned to believe that any resistance would only make things worse. In one horrifying detail shared by police, the victim described rigging a system just to urinate. He would use a bottle and connect straws to it, feeding them through a small hole in the storm window frame because he couldn't open the window itself. He was terrified that if he broke the window, his stepmother's retaliation would be unbearable. For 20 years, this was his reality, a life measured not by birthdays or holidays, but by the degrees of his hunger, the severity of his isolation, and the depth of his fear. By February 12, 2025, the victim, now 32 years old, had hit his breaking point. 2 decades of captivity had stolen his youth, his health, and his freedom, but it hadn't destroyed his will to live. He made a terrifying, life or death choice. The only way out was to bring the outside world crashing in. He was going to set a fire. He knew the immense risk. He knew the fire he was about to start could very well kill him. But in his mind, dying in the flames was a better fate than continuing to live in a locked room, slowly starving to death. He later told investigators he made a conscious choice to stay on the floor as the room filled with smoke, believing it was his only chance for survival and, ultimately, for rescue. The first sign that something was terribly wrong at the Blake Street house was a frantic 911 call from Kimberly Sullivan herself. Her voice, captured on the recording, was panicked as she reported the fire. But the most chilling part of the call was her exchange with the dispatcher. "Who else is in the house? Who else is in here?" the dispatcher asked. Sullivan's reply was haunting. "My stepson is in here." Firefighters and police raced to the scene, thinking it was a routine house fire. The quiet neighborhood was suddenly filled with the wail of sirens and flashing lights. They entered the smoke-filled home, their mission to find anyone trapped inside. But they didn't find him in an upstairs room. They found him downstairs. Curled in the fetal position under the kitchen table was what they initially thought was a small child. He was conscious but incredibly weak. The firefighters carried him from the burning house, his frail body telling a story of years of neglect. Once outside in the cold February air, as first responders assessed his condition, it was immediately clear this was no ordinary fire victim. He was severely emaciated, his hair was matted, and he was covered in filth. It was in those first few moments, as he received medical attention for smoke inhalation, that the horrifying truth began to spill out. A first responder asked him about the fire, and his answer was simple, direct, and utterly devastating. He said he set it on purpose because, "I wanted my freedom." With those 4 words, a simple house fire investigation turned into something far more sinister. The doors to the Waterbury House of Horrors had just been blown wide open. As the victim was rushed to the hospital, the scene on Blake Street turned from a fire response to a major criminal investigation. The first responders who carried him out were reeling from what they had just seen and heard. Waterbury Police Chief Fernando Spagnolo would later say the initial report was almost too shocking to believe. Frankly, what was being reported was unfathomable to us at that point in time. He stated at a press conference, "At the hospital, the true horror of the victim's suffering became clear. At 32 years old, he stood 5 feet, 9 inches tall, but weighed only 68 pounds. His body mass index, or BMI, was a shocking 11. To put that in perspective, doctors consider a BMI under 16 to be starvation, and anything below 13 is life-threatening. Medically speaking, he was in the advanced stages of wasting away, a condition where the body, deprived of nutrients, starts to consume its own fat and muscle. He was literally disappearing. His physical condition told a story of profound and long-term neglect. His teeth were rotten from 2 decades without a dentist. His muscles had withered from lack of use, and he had severe orthopedic problems. His uncle would later describe him as looking like a survivor of the Holocaust. The medical team wasn't just treating him for smoke inhalation. They were treating a man who had been systematically starved to the brink of death. Doctors were stunned he was even still alive. Back on Blake Street, investigators pieced together the evidence. Just as firefighters had first noted, The bedroom upstairs had locks on the outside of the door, backing up his claim of being held captive. As police searched the home, they found physical evidence that painted a grim picture. Photos released by the police showed the cluttered, squalid conditions inside. They documented the multiple, heavy-duty locks on his bedroom door, physical proof of his imprisonment. Chief Spagnolo described the conditions inside his room as worse than those found in a jail cell. It was a space designed for containment, not for living. The mystery was deepening with every new detail. This wasn't a case of neglect born from ignorance or poverty. The evidence pointed to a deliberate, methodical, and long-term campaign of imprisonment and abuse. The police, working with the state's attorney's office, knew they were at the start of an investigation into one of the most shocking cases of human cruelty their city had ever seen. While the victim began his long road to recovery, the Waterbury Police Department's Major Crimes Unit launched a full-scale investigation. For the next 3.5 weeks, they painstakingly gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses, and served search warrants to build a case against Kimberly Sullivan. The most critical evidence came from the victim himself. In detailed interviews, he laid out the 20-year ordeal, providing a timeline of the abuse that was both harrowing and consistent. He talked about being pulled from school, the locks on his door, the constant hunger, and the fear of retaliation that kept him silent for so long. He detailed how his stepmother would allegedly coach him on what to say during the few times DCF had visited years ago, threatening him with even less food if he didn't lie for her. His testimony was the heart of the investigation, a first-hand account of the horrors he'd lived through. The physical evidence from the Blake Street home powerfully supported his story. The different types of exterior locks on his bedroom door were proof he wasn't free to leave. The state of the room, and the filth throughout the house, provided a backdrop for the neglect he described. Investigators also dug into the family's past, confirming his history with the Department of Children and Families and the timeline of his removal from school. On March 12, 2025, nearly a month after the fire, the investigation led to an arrest. Kimberly Sullivan, age 56, was taken into custody. She was charged with a list of felonies that spoke to the gravity of her alleged crimes: second-degree kidnapping, first-degree assault, intentional cruelty to a person, unlawful restraint, and reckless endangerment. The reaction from law enforcement was one of deep shock and disgust. Waterbury Police Chief Fernando Spagnolo didn't mince words. "In 33 years in law enforcement, this is the worst treatment of humanity that I've ever witnessed," he declared. He and prosecutors compared the facts of the case to something out of a horror movie. The details were so disturbing that even seasoned investigators had a hard time processing them. Kimberly Sullivan, however, claimed she was innocent. According to her attorney, Ioannis Kaloides, she was blown away and stunned by the allegations. He stated publicly, "From our perspective, these allegations are not true. They are outlandish. She's adamant they are not true. This did not happen." He argued that people shouldn't rush to judgment and that his client planned to fight the charges. "I'm sorry she's been convicted worldwide, and everyone wants to proceed to a lynching. But she has rights, and we intend on protecting them." Kaloides said. The battle lines were drawn. On one side, a mountain of evidence and the harrowing testimony of a survivor. On the other, a firm denial and the promise of a fight in court. After her arrest, Kimberly Sullivan appeared in Waterbury's Superior Court. Bail was set, and she was eventually released on a $300,000 bond, but her release came with strings attached. Prosecutors, worried about the nature of the case, successfully motioned to add GPS monitoring, though their request for full house arrest was denied. In the courtroom, Sullivan officially entered a plea of not guilty to all charges. This kicked off a series of pretrial hearings as both sides prepared for a potential trial. These hearings dealt with legal procedures and the sharing of evidence. One of the key battles quickly became about the victim's medical records. The state filed a protective order to keep his new, chosen name and other private details out of the public record. But the defense pushed back, demanding to see every detail of those records. Sullivan's attorney, Ioannis Kaloides, made it clear they were going to challenge the state's story about the victim's condition. There's a claim that he was starved near death. "We've heard about Holocaust. I haven't seen anything to support that," he told reporters. "Just because someone's 68 pounds doesn't mean anything to me. If those are the claims they're making at trial, we'd like to see it," He also suggested there could be other explanations for the victim's low weight. This signaled a defense strategy aimed at undermining the very foundation of the prosecution's case. Just how bad the victim's physical state was, and whether it was directly caused by his stepmother. Another motion from the defense sought the return of Kimberly Sullivan's cell phone, which police had seized as evidence. The legal chess game continued through the spring and summer of 2025, with court dates scheduled and postponed. The judge made it clear that while Sullivan could skip some of these initial hearings, she would be required to appear in person for the more important ones down the line. The case has drawn national attention, putting immense pressure on the justice system. As of the latest updates, the case is still in the pretrial phase, with everyone bracing for what is expected to be a complex and highly emotional legal battle. The community, the family, and the victim himself are all waiting for the day when the full story will finally be told in a court of law. While the legal system churned forward, the victim's biological family was hit with a tidal wave of shock, guilt, and just gut-wrenching grief. The news of his discovery and the details of his two-decade nightmare was unbearable. His biological mother, Tracy Valorand, and his uncle spoke publicly about their pain, their voices cracking with regret. The victim's uncle recounted being systematically pushed away by Kimberly Sullivan over the years. During the rare visits he was allowed, he felt a barrier he just couldn't break through. He described the heart-stopping moment he finally saw his nephew after the rescue, comparing his emaciated appearance to that of a Holocaust survivor. The image was a brutal confirmation of horrors he could have never fully imagined. Tracy Valorand attended the court hearings, a stoic and heartbroken presence, determined to be a voice for her son. She described herself and her family as being traumatized by what they learned. In a statement, she spoke of the unimaginable pain of knowing what her son went through. She stressed that despite the long years of separation and silence, her son has never been forgotten. She knows his recovery will take years, not months. And though she hasn't yet been able to speak with him directly, she knows he has gotten her letters and wants him to know one thing above all. I am always here. I will always be here. The family's pain was mixed with a sense of helplessness, of wondering what more they could have done. They were on the outside looking in, their concerns and attempts to connect allegedly shut down by the woman who held their loved one captive. The discovery brought not just the horror of the present, but the heavy weight of the past, a past filled with missed chances and unanswered questions. They are now faced with the monumental task of helping a man they lost as a boy reclaim his life, all while navigating their own deep grief and trauma. The story from the house on Blake Street sent a shockwave through Waterbury. Neighbors who had lived just feet away for years were horrified. They struggled to connect the quiet image of the Sullivan home with the torture chamber it allegedly concealed. I never in a million years, never thought that that was happening across the street from me, one neighbor told a reporter. Another expressed a sense of despair, saying, "To know I was right by here this whole time, and he was going through that suffering, it's heartbreaking." The street, once a symbol of quiet suburbia, became a media hub, its residents left wondering how such a monstrous secret could be kept for so long. The case also threw a harsh spotlight on the Connecticut Department of Children and Families, DCF. As the investigation unfolded, it was revealed that the agency had looked into 6 separate reports about the boy's well-being between 1996 and 2005. This raised an immediate and urgent question. Why wasn't he saved? In response to the public outcry, DCF released a summary of an internal review. The agency stated that despite the half-dozen reports, under the law at the time, they simply lacked enough evidence to prove the allegations or remove the child from the home. Investigators had visited the house, saw that food was available, and spoke with the family and the children, who never disclosed any abuse. They even contacted the boy's pediatrician, who reportedly had no concerns. The victim himself explained why those investigations failed. He told police his stepmother, Kimberly Sullivan, coached him on what to say. She forced him to tell the authorities that everything was fine, threatening him that his already tiny portions of food would get even smaller if he didn't. This insidious manipulation turned the victim into an unwilling accomplice in his own imprisonment. DCF's last contact with the family was around 2005, the same year he was pulled from school for good. The system designed to protect vulnerable children had been defeated. The case has become a tragic example of how hard it is to detect hidden abuse, especially when a child is cut off from school and other parts of the community. It shows how a determined abuser can manipulate the situation to hide their crimes in plain sight. For the survivor of the Waterbury House of Horrors, freedom isn't just a moment. It's a long and difficult journey. After his rescue, he began a process of healing that will have to address 2 decades of profound physical and psychological trauma. For the first time in his adult life, he is making his own choices, and one of the first and most powerful was to leave his old name behind. He asked the public to call him S, stating, "I am choosing a new name for myself, and I will use that name as I reclaim control over my life and my future. My name is my choice, and it is the first of many choices I will make for myself now that I am free." His physical recovery is a delicate medical challenge. Doctors are working to reverse the effects of severe, long-term malnutrition. This includes carefully managing refeeding syndrome, a potentially deadly condition that can happen when a starved person starts to eat again. His immune system, bones, heart, and other vital organs have all been damaged, and every step toward health must be taken with extreme caution. The psychological wounds are just as deep, if not deeper. Clinical psychologists explain that survivors of this kind of prolonged trauma often suffer from severe PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Their bodies and minds have been in a constant state of crisis for years. Rebuilding a sense of self, a feeling of safety, and the ability to trust other people is a monumental task that requires intensive, specialized therapy. But S is not on this journey alone. The community that was horrified by his story has rallied to support him. Safe Haven of Greater Waterbury, a local organization, started a GoFundMe campaign to help cover the enormous costs of his medical care and everything he'll need to start a new life from scratch. The response was incredible, with hundreds of thousands of dollars pouring in from around the world from people touched by his story. In a public statement, S expressed his gratitude. "I am much better and stronger than I was the day the first responders carried me out of my home." He wrote, "I am beyond grateful for the care I have received since then." He thanked the healthcare professionals who have been nurturing him and shared a poignant detail of his new life. At 32 years old, he celebrated his first ever birthday party. It was such a simple act, but a profound symbol of his reclaimed humanity. He is a survivor, and his journey, though difficult, is now his own, defined by hope and a future he is finally free to choose. On a quiet street in Waterbury, Connecticut, stood a house that looked just like any other. It was a place where neighbors waved, where life seemed to follow a predictable, suburban rhythm. But behind its closed doors, a secret of unimaginable cruelty was being kept. For over 2 decades, a young man was allegedly held prisoner, not by a stranger, but by his own stepmother. This is a story about the systematic breaking of a human being, the failures of the systems meant to protect him, and the desperate act that finally brought the darkness into the light. It's a case that forces us all to ask a terrifying question. How well do we really know the people living right next door? The story of S is a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. If you want to see more content that delves into complex cases and the quest for justice, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and clicking that notification bell. I'd also like to hear your thoughts on this case in the comments below. How can a community do a better job of protecting the most vulnerable among us? The case of the Waterbury House of Horrors is a story of profound darkness, but it's also a story of incredible strength. It exposes the terrifying cruelty that can hide behind a normal suburban house and the cracks in the system that can allow a child to disappear from the world. It leaves us with uncomfortable questions. How many other secrets are hidden behind closed doors? What can we, as a society, do to be more vigilant, to see the signs that are so often missed? But amidst the horror, the focus has to remain on the survivor, a man now known as S who, after 2 decades of unimaginable suffering, found the courage to light a fire, not of destruction, but of liberation. His journey is a testament to the fact that even after years of darkness, the will to be free can burn brighter than any flame. In his own words, he is now reclaiming his life and having his say in how his story is told. And while justice is still being sought in a courtroom, his survival is, in itself, the ultimate victory. Someday, he said, maybe his whole story will be told. Until then, his message is one of hope, a powerful declaration that even from the deepest depths of despair, a new life can begin.